Hello fellow bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantly Bookish. Today I have a very belated Victober Wrap Up to share with you. I had such an amazing time co-hosting Victober this year, and I made a lot of videos that I'm really proud of, and I had a great time watching so much of the wonderful Victober content from others as well. What I ended up reading and watching actually differed quite a bit from my TBR. It wasn't what I originally intended, and I didn't get around to everything that I wanted to either. But what else is new with Victober? I did read some amazing books and watch some adaptations that I'd love to chat about though. So let's get into it. The first book I finished in October was a reread for me, and that was The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. I listened to this on audiobook and had started as a buddy read with Katie from Books and Things in September, but I didn't finish it well into Victober. I had originally read this one in college, which seems like ages ago at this point, and I'd forgotten so much about this book. Strangely, the only characters I did remember were the woman in white and the quintessential scene involving her towards the very beginning of the book, and also Count Fosco. But I had a very caricaturized memory of Count Fosco that didn't really include his nuances as a character, because he is a really interesting character. Anyway, The Woman in White is a Victorian sensation novel and precursor to the mystery genre, and one of Wilkie Collins's best-known books. It begins with the character of Walter Hartwright, who is a drawing master on a journey to his new position, teaching two girls, Laura Fairley and her half-sister, Marianne Halcombe, when he sees this startling apparition, a mysterious and distressed woman clad all in white. He helps her on her journey, only to find out shortly afterwards that she's escaped from an insane asylum. Meanwhile, at his new job, it becomes apparent that his encounter with the women in white is somehow linked to his new pupils, Laura and Marion, and the three of them become caught up in the mystery of the woman in white. This book is such fun to read. The story is plot-heavy, full of twists and turns, and the pacing is excellent. It's told from the perspectives of a bunch of different characters, but mainly Laura, Walter, and Marion, which is a pretty standard way to tell a story nowadays, but it was pretty novel for the Victorians, and is something that Wilkie Collins plays around with in his other books as well. The Woman in White has a wonderful atmosphere of suspense and tension that is just perfect for fall and for Victober, and just a delight to get swept up in. The book deals with its themes of marriage and secrets and class and mental illness in really interesting ways as well. The one thing I don't love about The Woman in White, though, is its portrayal of gender. There are plenty of Victorian novels that have problematic portrayals of gender and of female characters, but for some reason, the way Laura Fairley and Marianne Halcombe are portrayed and talked about in the text really irks me in a way that a lot of other Victorian novels don't. Both characters are patronized by the male characters in the text, but even more troublesomely internalize this mentality and talk about the inferiority of women and therefore themselves in ways that really do bother me. I think the gender dynamics in this book irritate me so much because the sexism and the problematic passages don't just come from specific characters, but seem to pervade all of the characters in a way that doesn't usually happen in a Victorian novel, and it makes it seem like it's coming from the author himself. Overall, I like The Woman in White a lot, but thinking of it just reminds me how much more I love The Moonstone. While The Moonstone does not have the same spooky, atmospheric tone as The Woman in White, it does so many of the same things that I like about The Woman in White, like the narrative structure and the suspense and pacing, and it does those things just as well, if not better. I think it also treats gender a little differently. In The Moonstone, it seems like any problematic views on gender are held by the individual characters rather than becoming a pervading theme of the text itself. And The Moonstone has such memorable and wonderful characters. So The Woman in White is a great book, and I'm definitely glad that I did reread it, but I do think I prefer The Moonstone. I'm curious to know if you have a preference between the two, if you agree with me, or if you are a diehard fan of The Woman in White. The next book I read in Victober was also a reread, and that was Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. I actually started watching the 2007 BBC TV series of Cranford, and then found out that I had an intense desire to not only reread the book, but to read the other short works that Gaskell wrote, which are incorporated into the series. So I also read My Lady Ludlow and Mr. Harrison's Confessions, which I will talk about in a little bit. I had forgotten quite how much I love Cranford. It's this quiet little book about a small, female-centric Victorian town, mostly full of widows and spinsters, and it captures the spirit and daily rhythm of Cranford. It's episodic in nature, so it doesn't really have much of a plot besides the town and the characters that bind it together, but oh, it is so delightful nonetheless. It highlights bonds of female friendship and the strong sense of community that Cranford has. It's all about life in the close-knit, quaint country town ruled by old-fashioned values, and it focuses mostly on Miss Maddie and Miss Deborah Jenkins, who are two middle-aged spinsters living in genteel poverty. But there's such a fun cast of other characters as well in these little vignettes, and by the end of the book, you just feel like you're part of this warm Cranford community with all of its hardships and all of its joys. Sometimes this book is hysterical, featuring cows out to pasture in flannel pajamas, and a particularly humorous episode of a cat who swallows one of the characters' best lace collars. And sometimes the book can be incredibly emotional and moving, but the book surprisingly also includes multiple deaths, financial struggles, illness, estrangement. And I say surprisingly because despite its heavier subject matter at times, and despite the way it tackles some pretty serious themes of feminism and class and the implications of class and empire, the book still gives off that feeling of being very light and fluffy and sentimental and sweet with all of these humorous anecdotes. Even though Gaskell does incorporate heavier subject matter, as a reader, I'm left feeling a pervading sense of humor and levity. Cranford is like receiving a cozy little book hug, and I'm so glad that I decided to revisit it this Victober. Mr. Harrison's Confessions is the perfect accompaniment to Cranford, and I see exactly why it was included in the BBC adaptation. It's one of Gaskell's short stories, and it possesses the same levity and tone as Cranford, and it even takes place in a town whose description is uncannily like Cranford's. It's about a young doctor named Mr. Harrison who joins Mr. Morgan's medical practice in the small country town of Duncombe, which, like I said, may as well be retitled Cranford. It's about Mr. Harrison's adjustment to country life, his medical adventures, and trying to win over the trust of the townsfolk. Mr. Harrison has to deal with interfering and malicious town gossip, and at one point he has to deal with rumors of his engagement to not one, but 3 different women. The misunderstandings and humor are absolutely hysterical and reminiscent of a Shakespeare comedy. This is such a fun little tale of Gaskell's, and if you've read and enjoyed Cranford, I do highly recommend picking up Mr. Harrison's Confessions as well. My Lady Ludlow is another one of the source materials for the BBC adaptation of Cranford. But unlike Mr. Harrison's Confessions, I don't think it fits in quite as well with the other texts, nor did I enjoy reading it nearly as much. My Lady Ludlow is about Lady Ludlow, a well-respected member of the English aristocracy, who's known for her generosity and goodwill, but she's also very traditional and opposed to any change in social order, which is probably most notably evident in her staunch opposition to the education of the poor. The short work is full of little episodes that challenge Lady Ludlow's views of the roles of the lower and middle classes and highlight the mentality of the aristocracy in the early 1800s and how their viewpoints were directly influenced by the terrors of the French Revolution. While I appreciated the themes of class and social mobility that the text raised and the very important historical context of the work, I simply didn't enjoy reading about these characters. Lady Ludlow was quite unlikable, which of course was part of the point, but she was unlikable in a way that I didn't enjoy reading about her. And I also found the narrator of the text to be distant and rather unremarkable. For me, these types of episodic narratives such as Cranford and Mr. Harrison's Confessions really only work when the reader forms a strong connection with the characters and a genuine interest in learning about them and their lives, which I just didn't get from My Lady Ludlow. Plus, I was very distracted by a large section in the middle of the narrative about an aristocrat running off to France during the Revolution to try to rescue his cousin, who he's loved for years. It's interesting for me, after reading this short work, to think about why it was included in the BBC adaptation. It does make sense in some ways, as both Cranford and My Lady Ludlow deal with pretensions of class, albeit in slightly different ways. But overall, I still kind of wish that the adaptation stuck to Cranford and Mr. Harrison's confessions. I do still love the Cranford adaptation, though. I'm curious if you've watched the BBC adaptation of Cranford. Did you enjoy it? Have you read some or all of the Gaskell source material that it uses? And what do you think of the inclusion of My Lady Ludlow in the adaptation? Does the inclusion of My Lady Ludlow change or inform your understanding of Cranford in any way? I am really curious to hear what you think about this, so please let's chat in the comments below. For Roz's challenge this Victober, I read a whole bunch of Edward Lear poems and limericks that she linked in her various videos. I think my favorite was The Dong with the Luminous Nose. I absolutely love the absurdity of that poem and the way it plays with rhythm and syntax in the English language. I also love the strange, vivid imagery that his poems conjure. They end up looking kind of like Dr. Seuss illustrations in my head. The Dong with the Luminous Nose also reminds me of The Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll, which is another really fun and somewhat absurd poem. I'm not great at analyzing poems, and while there's probably something more to get out of Edward Lear's poetry other than sheer entertainment and enjoyment, I read these at a pretty surface level and don't really have much more to say on the subject. But Roz did have an amazing Victober video all about Edward Lear, and I do highly recommend that you check that out if you missed it in the month of October, so I'll link that down below. And the last book that I finished for Victober was the group read The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. This book is all about the flawed and complicated character of Michael Henchard, who at the age of 21 gets very, very drunk and sells his wife and infant daughter. He just auctions them off in a tent full of people, kind of like cattle. The next day, Henchard wakes up with a massive hangover and is ashamed and regretful of his actions. He takes a vow of sobriety for the next 21 years. He reinvents himself in the town of Casterbridge, becoming successful in the agricultural industry, accumulating wealth, and the title of Mayor of Casterbridge. It's at this point, 18 years after the opening chapters of the book, that his wife and daughter come back into his life following the death of the sailor who purchased them, and the plot just goes on from there. I really enjoyed the first half of this book and the themes that the book as a whole evokes. I love the way Hardy creates such a flawed character in Michael Henchard with such psychological depth, who you feel sympathy for, even though you don't like him. He lets his temper and his rash decisions interfere with his relationships with those around him. And it's fascinating how the book explores this by examining his actions and those who his actions have affected in depth, specifically his daughter, Elizabeth Jane. I found it fascinating the way that the book looks at themes of family and redemption, at secrecy and class and social mobility and reputation, especially a woman's reputation, most notably explored in the characters of Elizabeth Jane and Lucetta. In true Hardy fashion, there are absolutely beautiful descriptions of nature, of course. I feel like you can't actually talk about a Hardy book without at least briefly acknowledging the gorgeous writing and the gorgeous descriptive language that he uses. I loved so much about this book, and yet I found myself struggling a little bit during the second half. I think that part of that is I did put the book down for quite a while between volumes 1 and 2, but also the plot in the second half of the book becomes even more melodramatic and even more full of plot twists and turns. There's a love triangle. Well, actually, no, it's not a triangle. It's 4 people, so it's a love rectangle, I guess, that I did not care for, which takes up most of the plot of the second half of the book. The characters seem to change their romantic interests in each other rather too quickly for me, in some cases, to enjoy it and to find it believable. And while I thought that the character of Michael Henchard was fully developed, I found a few of the characters around him to be a bit lackluster in comparison. I would have liked Donald Farfrae, for example, to be explored more as a character, especially in his attitude toward his relationship with Henchard. And I thought that Elizabeth Jane, too, was just a little bit underdeveloped. And it may just be that next to such a fully realized character like Michael Henchard, it's hard to create the same depth in all the characters, but I still felt like there was just something lacking in the motivation and explanation of some of the characters' sudden changes of heart towards the end of the book. Overall, The Mayor of Casterbridge was a very enjoyable read, but I had expected it to be even more impactful and more amazing than it was. So that is what I read for Victober this year. I didn't get around to nearly everything that I wanted to, but I'll just have to remember that I can absolutely read Victorian literature outside of the month of October. So I hope you all had wonderful Victobers as well. I would love to hear what your favorite things that you read in the month were in the comments down below. What did you think of the books that I mentioned, and what were your favorite Victober videos that people posted? It's almost a month later and I'm still a bit behind and have so much to catch up on. So I want to make sure I don't miss anything. Happy reading, and I hope to see you all in another video very soon. Bye.